What happens when you force together peoples divided by language, culture, and religion under the promise of unity? Yugoslavia seemed to hold the answer, until it collapsed in a storm of violence that shocked the world. But its story didn't begin with the wars of the 1990s. To understand how a country once seen as a symbol of multicultural cooperation fell apart, we need to go back centuries. From the South Slavs under Ottoman and Habsburg rule, through Balkan Wars, 2 World Wars, Royal Dictatorship, Communist Revolution, and Cold War non-alignment, Yugoslavia was always more fragile than it seemed. This is how a dream of unity became a struggle for survival, and a cautionary tale of what happens when identity, power, and history collide. The South Slavs came into the Balkans during the early medieval migrations of the 6th and 7th centuries. At that time, the region was already a crossroads of cultures, shaped by Greek, Roman, and Byzantine influence. These new Slavic arrivals spread across mountainous terrain and fertile valleys, establishing communities that stretched from the eastern Alps down to the shores of the Adriatic and into the central Balkans. Today, their descendants live in places like Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria. But in those early centuries, their political structures were far from centralized. Villages, tribes, and loosely ruled principalities defined their lives, and local leaders often exercised more authority than any distant monarch or foreign emperor. By the Middle Ages, these societies began forming recognizable kingdoms and principalities, though their fortunes rose and fell within the larger power struggles of Europe. For instance, Croats and Slovenes found themselves under the growing influence of the Hungarian crown and later the Habsburg dynasty. In contrast, many Serbs organized their own medieval states centered around powerful rulers, but constantly faced the advance of Byzantium in the east. Bosnia stood somewhere in between, with its distinct church traditions and periods of autonomy before larger neighbors pressed their claims. Rather than a single, large political entity, the South Slavic lands were a patchwork of territories that shifted ownership depending on who held the military or political advantage at any given time. This fragile fragmentation was quickly exposed once the great empires began pushing into the region. The Ottoman Empire advanced into the Balkans during the late Middle Ages, expanding south from Anatolia and east from Thrace. Their victories at battles like Kosovo in 1389 marked the beginning of centuries of Ottoman control in Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, and large segments of Montenegro. Meanwhile, the Habsburg dynasty gradually extended its reach over northern and western territories, including present-day Slovenia and parts of Croatia. Living for centuries under rival empires, the South Slavs came to embody 2 different political and cultural worlds, separated sharply by both religion and governance. Religion played a central role in defining identities. Under the Catholic Habsburgs, Croats and Slovenes aligned themselves with Latin Christianity and the papacy. Under the Orthodox traditions of the medieval Serbian Church, Serbs developed firmly within Eastern Christianity, which had its patriarch in Constantinople. Under Ottoman rule, many Bosnians converted to Islam, either voluntarily or through the incentives of social and legal privileges tied to conversion. As a result, shared Slavic linguistic roots were increasingly overshadowed by the distinct religious heritages that molded politics, culture, and loyalties across the centuries. These divisions would not only shape medieval and early modern life, but continue to define rivalries well into the modern age. Despite all this, the concept of a shared identity based on being South Slavic did not exist for most of this period. People called themselves Croat, Serb, Slovene, or Bosnian, but no one referred to themselves as Yugoslav. Allegiances tied directly to church, dynasty, or empire rather than to an ethnic unity. Only with the sweeping intellectual changes of the 19th century would some thinkers begin to imagine a political future in which all South Slavs stood together in one state. The very word Yugoslavia, which simply meant land of the South Slavs, was not the program of any ruling power, but an idea first drafted by intellectuals and revolutionaries trying to shape an alternative future. One striking cultural detail shows just how deeply the past remained alive in these lands. In parts of Croatia, priests continued to write in Glagolitic, one of the earliest Slavic alphabets, until the 1800s. Long after most of Europe had moved to standardized print languages, this ancient script tied local communities to centuries-old practices of worship and literacy. It reflected how uneven, layered, and historically complex the cultural identity of the South Slavs remained. Settled side by side, they shared similarities of language and heritage, yet their everyday lives were divided by empires, doctrines, and traditions that made unity a nearly impossible prospect during this long pre-Yugoslav era. During the 19th century, a wave of romantic nationalism spread through Europe, reshaping how different groups thought of themselves and their place in history. For the South Slavs, who had long been divided under foreign empires, this new mood encouraged intellectuals to turn inward and ask what bound their people together. They began uncovering traditional songs, folk stories, and linguistic ties as evidence of a shared past. These rediscoveries were not just academic projects. They carried a political undercurrent, suggesting that perhaps the different Slavic groups scattered across the Balkans and Central Europe could stand as something more than just subjects of Austria, Hungary, or the Ottoman Sultan. In Croatia, this idea gained traction through the Illyrian movement. Leaders there invoked the ancient name Illyrian, not because it was historically precise, but because it offered a unifying label that went beyond narrow local or tribal identities. Writers, scholars, and reformers embraced this concept, working toward an elevated vision of South Slavs linked by culture and language. Their poetry, songs, and journalism framed unity as both possible and necessary, even if the political conditions at the time made it nearly impossible to achieve. What started as cultural revivalism carried the seeds of political ambition, and many in Vienna and Budapest were quick to notice where it was leading. Meanwhile, in Serbia, a different form of national consciousness was taking shape. Having secured independence from Ottoman rule in the first half of the 19th century, Serbia stood apart as one South Slavic state that was already sovereign. Intellectuals there took advantage of this independence to revive medieval Serbian traditions, celebrate Orthodox heritage, and emphasize continuity from the days of medieval Serbian kingdoms. The result was a form of pan-Slavism that positioned Serbia as a natural leader of any future South Slavic state. For Serbs, the path forward seemed more straightforward than for Croats or Slovenes, who still lived under Habsburg rule and had to balance their rising nationalism with loyalty to a powerful empire. This is where nationalism became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered the possibility of uniting Slavs who had long been fragmented. On the other, it sharpened divisions. Catholic Croats, Orthodox Serbs, Muslim Bosniaks, and Slovenes under Austrian influence often expressed their national pride in ways that clashed rather than converged. Unity under the concept of a shared Slavic identity might inspire students, poets, and activists, but it often alarmed ruling powers and divided communities along new and old lines at the same time. Nationalism promised freedom from empires, but it also made clear how different empires had shaped each population for centuries. Authorities in Vienna and Budapest treated these movements with suspicion. The Austro-Hungarian Empire contained dozens of languages, religions, and national groups, and any talk of Slavic unity looked to officials like a threat to imperial stability. Censorship, political repression, and attempts to undermine nationalist associations were common responses. Yet such resistance sometimes gave the movements even more energy, since activists could portray their struggles as proof that their cultural survival was at risk. The very act of suppressing nationalist movements often turned them into rallying cries that were hard to silence. During this time, reformers like the Croatian poet Ljudevit Gaj promoted the idea of a shared literary standard, believing that common written language could cut across fragmented dialects. He even created a new alphabet system to match this vision. While not fully adopted by all South Slavs, it laid the groundwork for what later became known as Serbo-Croatian. This effort reveals how deeply nationalism intertwined with cultural projects, as if literature and language themselves were instruments of political destiny. By the early 20th century, nationalism had taken on an even sharper edge. Societies like Narodna Obrana, which began as groups focused on defense and promotion of Serbian causes, expanded their activities into secretive efforts aimed at shaping political outcomes across the Balkans. Such groups were influential enough that their ideas linked directly to high-profile acts of violence. One of their ideological branches helped inspire the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, an action that would ignite the First World War. What started in the 19th century as songs, poems, and cultural festivals had, within a few generations, transformed into conspiracies and armed struggle. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire still controlled huge stretches of territory in the Balkans, but its power was visibly in decline. For the South Slavs living under Ottoman rule or near its borders, this weakness created an opportunity. By 1912, a coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria, formed what became known as the Balkan League. Their aim was simple but ambitious. They wanted to drive the Ottomans out of Europe once and for all, and then divide the lands that had been under Ottoman control for centuries. This alliance brought together states with overlapping ambitions, and though unity was fragile, it was strong enough to launch the First Balkan War. The war began in October 1912, and within just a few weeks, the Ottoman armies struggled on multiple fronts. Montenegro made early advancements, and Serbian forces moved deep into Kosovo and northern Macedonia. Victories by Greek troops on the southern front dismantled Ottoman control along the coast, while Bulgarians pushed east toward Thrace, attempting to secure routes that could bring them directly to Constantinople. The rapid collapse of Ottoman authority in these areas was striking, given that so much of southeastern Europe had been firmly under their grip for centuries. For Serbia in particular, the gains were dramatic. Its territory almost doubled, expanding into Kosovo and much of Macedonia, lands that carried both symbolic value and practical advantage. Serbia's expansion now created a sense of confidence among its political and military leaders. Many saw their victories as evidence that Serbia could lead the cause of South Slavic unification. A larger territorial base and greater prestige meant that Serbia was positioned more strongly in any future movement that sought to unite the fragmented Slavic populations across the region. But with these gains came new problems. Macedonia, for example, was claimed by multiple sides. Bulgarians pointed to their cultural and ecclesiastical ties, while Greeks, Serbs, and even local groups had their own arguments. Instead of resolving rivalries, the divisions grew sharper once liberation from Ottoman rule became reality. The peace did not last long. By the summer of 1913, tensions inside the victorious coalition erupted into the Second Balkan War. Bulgaria, Dissatisfied with its comparatively small share of land that had been fought for in the First Balkan War, turned on its former allies. Bulgarian forces attacked Serbia and Greece, hoping to secure more territory in Macedonia. The move backfired. The combined opposition of Serbia, Greece, Montenegro, and later Romania overwhelmed Bulgaria's armies, forcing it to retreat. The Treaty of Bucharest that ended the fighting left Bulgaria weakened, while Serbia emerged with even more territory added to its growing domain. For the South Slavs, these wars intensified the rivalries that nationalism had already stirred. Macedonia remained the focal point, each nation insisting on historic or linguistic claims, but no easy solution appeared. The victories left Serbia stronger, yet they also made Austria-Hungary nervous. Vienna saw a rising Serbia not only as a regional threat, but also as an influence that could stir its own Slavic population inside the multi-ethnic empire. That fear would later color every decision Austria made when tensions mounted in the summer of 1914. One notable aspect of these wars is how the world observed them. The Balkan Wars were the first to be widely captured on film and photography, giving international audiences images of trench warfare, destroyed towns, and mass mobilization before the eruption of the First World War. And despite Bulgaria's clashes with Serbia in 1913, it is worth remembering that less than a decade earlier, the two countries had secretly agreed to divide Ottoman lands between them. Such shifting alliances highlight the volatility of Balkan politics, a volatility that would echo in the conflicts still to come. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand traveled to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, a province then under Austro-Hungarian rule. What was supposed to be a symbolic visit quickly turned historic. A group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists plotted an attack against him. Among them was a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. When the Archduke's motorcade passed near the Latin Bridge, Princip fired the shots that killed both Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. The attack was not just a local event. It tapped directly into the tensions between Serb nationalists who wanted liberation from the empire and the leadership in Vienna, which feared the rising strength of Serbia. Austria-Hungary responded within weeks. Seeing the assassination as more than the act of an individual, the empire treated it as evidence of Serbian aggression. With backing from Germany, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. When Serbia's reply failed to satisfy Vienna, war was declared. Because of Europe's tightly interwoven alliance system, this conflict quickly spiraled into something much larger. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia, Germany stood beside Austria-Hungary, and France and Britain entered in response. What began in Sarajevo became the opening chapter of the First World War. For the South Slavs, the conflict immediately revealed a painful split. Serbs inside the Kingdom of Serbia fought alongside Allied forces, while Croats, Slovenes, and Bosniaks conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army were forced to fight for the Central Powers. Families and neighbors with a shared language might find themselves wearing different uniforms, standing on opposing sides of the same battlefield. The war tore communities apart, reflecting just how divided the South Slavic world remained, even as nationalist voices called for unity. The consequences were catastrophic, especially for Serbia. Between repeated invasions, hunger, disease, and massive military engagements, the country experienced one of the worst casualty rates in modern history. More than a quarter of its entire population perished, including a significant part of its male population of fighting age. For Serbia, this devastation also became a powerful symbol on the international stage. The country's survival and sacrifice won its sympathy abroad, and gave it leverage when the time came to reshape the region after the war. While soldiers fought on the front, politicians and intellectuals worked behind the scenes. In exile, South Slavic émigrés formed the Yugoslav Committee. Its members, mainly Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs living abroad, believed the war created a chance to achieve the dream of South Slavic unity. They pushed their case in London, Paris, and Washington, lobbying Allied powers to back a union once the Central Powers were defeated. Their vision often clashed with more cautious leaders at home who worried about giving up local autonomy, but the idea gained strength as the war dragged on. By 1917, a key step was taken with the Corfu Declaration. Leaders from Serbia and representatives of the Yugoslav Committee met on the Greek island of Corfu, where they formally agreed to work toward the establishment of a single South Slavic state. Though vague on the details of governance, it was a public promise that the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes would join together in one kingdom once peace returned. Gavrilo Princip himself, too young for execution under Austro-Hungarian law, spent the war imprisoned. He died of tuberculosis only 4 years later, never living to see the creation of the state he believed his actions might help inspire. Yet by the time of his death in 1918, the outcome of the war was shifting rapidly. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was collapsing, and the question of unification was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. As World War I came to an end in late 1918, the massive Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated almost overnight. What had once been one of Europe's dominant powers suddenly lost control of its territories, leaving behind uncertainty across Central and Southeastern Europe. For the South Slavs, this collapse opened the doorway to an idea that had been discussed for decades, combining their fragmented lands into a single political unit. The vacuum of authority created a rare opportunity, and local leaders moved quickly to secure it before larger neighbors tried to impose their own visions of the post-war settlement. On December 1, 1918, in Belgrade, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was officially proclaimed. King Peter I of Serbia, who had led his country through the war, stood as monarch of the new state. This kingdom included Serbia itself, Montenegro, which had already been annexed during the war, and South Slavic territories from the dissolved Austro-Hungarian Empire. These included Slovenia, Croatia, Dalmatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bringing together so many regions into one monarchy seemed to fulfill the long-standing nationalist dream of a South Slavic homeland. But the reality of building a unified country proved much more complicated. Although intellectuals and activists had celebrated visions of unity, in practice, the new state brought together deeply different traditions. Some leaders imagined a centralized country ruled from Belgrade, where all citizens were treated as one Yugoslav people. Others, particularly among Croats and Slovenes, wanted a looser federation where each group maintained stronger autonomy. Questions over how to balance central authority with regional independence immediately caused friction in the first governments formed after unification. Language and administration presented additional challenges. Different regions carried centuries of distinct practices, either under Habsburg or Ottoman rule, and these legacies shaped how law, education, and civil administration functioned. Standardizing legal systems proved especially difficult because territories like Dalmatia entered the new kingdom before arrangements for governance had been properly organized. In some areas, overlapping institutions operated at the same time, creating chaos for ordinary citizens trying to navigate courts, taxes, or official paperwork. This legal patchwork underscored how quickly unification had been rushed forward without solving practical problems. The Serbian monarchy and military played a dominant role in the structure of the state. Serbia's wartime sacrifice had been immense, and the kingdom's leaders viewed this as justification for their leading position. King Peter's royal house, already established and internationally recognized, became the natural foundation for authority. However, this dominance caused significant resentment among Croats, Slovenes, and others who felt they had gone from one empire to another, trading Vienna for Belgrade without achieving genuine equality. Political claims of unity often masked tensions that ran far deeper than external appearances suggested. The religious and ethnic divides of earlier centuries did not disappear with the proclamation of a kingdom. Catholic Croats, Orthodox Serbs, Muslim Bosniaks, and others all brought their own traditions and political expectations into this new experiment. The fact that these divisions were barely addressed in the rush to create the state meant the fault lines remained below the surface. While the name on paper suggested unity, the daily experience of many groups felt more like competition for influence. The official title, Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, was cumbersome and unwieldy, reflecting the attempt to acknowledge multiple groups within its wording. Yet most people casually referred to the state as Yugoslavia, a name far easier to use and familiar through earlier nationalist discussions. This informal usage outpaced the official change, which did not come until 1929, when the kingdom officially adopted the name Yugoslavia. The unification of 1918 seemed like a political triumph, but because it ignored long-standing disputes and differences, the experiment started on fragile ground. The enthusiasm of that December soon gave way to rivalries over power, culture, and governance. Those unresolved issues soon defined the political battles of the new state. By the late 1920s, the optimism that had greeted unification had given way to constant deadlock. Parliamentary politics in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes had stalled as parties representing different national groups refused to compromise. Croat representatives demanded more autonomy, Slovenes pushed for federal reforms, and Serb politicians insisted on maintaining central authority in Belgrade. The situation grew so tense that in June 1928, a violent incident broke out inside the National Assembly when a Montenegrin Serb deputy pulled a gun and shot several Croat representatives, killing two. This shocking attack deepened mistrust and made the parliamentary system appear incapable of holding the kingdom together. Against this backdrop, King Alexander I decided to intervene directly and reshape the political order from above. On January 6, 1929, Alexander suspended the Constitution, dissolved the National Assembly, and announced that he would rule under a royal dictatorship. His aim was to bypass fractured politics and restore authority by eliminating disputes over power sharing. He also declared a major symbolic change, renaming the country to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. The new title dropped specific references to Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, replacing them with a single label that suggested unity under one people. By doing this, Alexander hoped to suppress ethnic identities that had dominated political life and strengthen the idea of a collective Yugoslav identity. To further dilute regional loyalties, Alexander reorganized the map. He introduced administrative regions, called Banovinas, which deliberately cut across traditional ethnic and historic boundaries. The intention was to weaken nationalist strongholds and tie citizens to the monarchy rather than to their ethnic community. For example, Dalmatian Croats found themselves grouped with parts of Bosnia, while Serbs were scattered across different units rather than concentrated under one administration. It was a bold attempt to redraw the political geography of the state in favor of a new imposed identity. But the cost of this strategy came quickly. Political parties were banned outright, newspapers faced censorship, and police surveillance expanded. Secret police targeted Croat separatist organizations, especially the Ustasi movement operating underground and abroad, as well as communist activists who organized in industrial centers and among students. The regime justified these measures as necessary for stability, but opponents saw them as an attack on basic freedoms. The suppression of political voices only pushed resistance movements further toward radical methods. Instead of erasing ethnic divides, authoritarian measures hardened them. In Croatia, frustration with Belgrade deepened, and calls for autonomy grew louder even in exile communities. Many Croat nationalists fled to Hungary or Italy, where they found sympathetic governments that supported them against Yugoslavia. Other minorities, including Macedonians and Bosniaks, also felt increasingly alienated. Alexander's vision of unity appeared less like integration and more like domination, particularly from the perspective of groups who saw themselves as sidelined by Serb dominance in the army and administration. The king's dictatorship lasted only a few years. On October 9, 1934, while traveling to Marseille in France, Alexander was assassinated during a ceremonial state visit. The killing was organized jointly by the Ustasi and the International Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, both longtime opponents of Yugoslav centralism. The assassin, Vlado Chernozemski, fired at close range, killing not only Alexander but also the French foreign minister sitting beside him. The attack was captured on film, marking the first time in modern history that the death of a head of state was recorded by news cameras. It stunned the world and confirmed how unstable Yugoslavia remained beneath the surface. Chernozemski had no plans for escape and carried out the attack with precision. Reports later revealed that the plot had been carefully prepared with backup shooters and even accomplices disguised as journalists. Alexander's death left a power vacuum since his son Peter II was still a boy. A regency council stepped in to rule, but without the king's personal control, the authoritarian framework he created quickly began to unravel, leaving the country again drifting into instability. When King Alexander was assassinated in Marseille in 1934, the succession question could not be resolved directly. His son, Peter II, was still a minor, which meant the country entered a regency. The person who came to dominate this arrangement was Prince Paul Karađorđević, Alexander's cousin. For much of the following decade, it was Paul who shaped Yugoslavia's internal and foreign policies, even though Peter's name provided the monarchy's legitimacy. Governing through compromise became his main challenge, but the problem was that no compromise ever seemed enough for the different groups in the kingdom. Inside the country, disagreements grew more pronounced. The Serb establishment, based in Belgrade, tried to hold on to centralized authority. Croats, however, felt increasingly alienated, particularly after years of Alexander's attempt to suppress their parties and organizations. Slovenes wanted guarantees that their autonomy would be respected, while Bosniaks, Macedonians, and other minorities felt that no one was representing their interests. By the late 1930s, it was clear that the state remained fractured and directionless, divided into communities that could not agree on how the monarchy should be structured. In 1939, an arrangement was attempted to calm tensions. Known as the Cvetković-Maček Agreement, it created the Banovia of Croatia, granting Croatian lands broader autonomy under their own administration. At first glance, this looked like a model solution, but in practice, it encouraged other communities to seek similar treatment. Slovenes and Bosniaks pointed to the Croatian precedent and asked why they could not receive equal recognition. Macedonians voiced complaints about their lack of cultural rights. The agreement satisfied a portion of the population, but made overall demands for change much louder. Instead of stabilizing the country, it revealed how fragile the political balance had become. While these internal divisions deepened, external dangers grew even faster. Across Europe, fascism and Nazism were on the rise. Italy, under Mussolini, had ambitions in the Adriatic. Germany, under Hitler, was expanding rapidly after annexing Austria in 1938 and dismantling Czechoslovakia in 1939. Yugoslavia suddenly found itself surrounded by powerful neighbors whose ideology and interests threatened its independence. Facing this situation, Prince Paul chose a cautious foreign policy. He leaned toward appeasement, hoping that by showing goodwill to Berlin and Rome, he could buy time for Yugoslavia and keep it out of the brewing global war. That balancing act could only last for so long. By March 1941, Hitler demanded a clear commitment. Under enormous pressure, Yugoslavia signed the Tripartite Pact, formally aligning with the Axis powers. Paul hoped the move would shield the country from immediate invasion, but ordinary citizens saw it as nothing less than betrayal. Protests broke out, especially in Belgrade, where crowds filled the streets shouting against the agreement. Demonstrations grew too large, and Paul's policy of quiet compromise fell apart in a matter of days. On March 27, 1941, a coup d'etat supported by Britain removed the Regency Council from power. The young King Peter II was declared of age, even though he was only 17, and the government reversed course on its alliance with the Axis. The move shocked Hitler. He had assumed Yugoslavia would submit to the new political order in Europe, but instead, the country pledged to resist. Preparing an invasion became his immediate priority. The coup carried consequences far beyond Yugoslavia's borders. Hitler delayed Operation Barbarossa, his invasion of the Soviet Union, by several weeks to redirect German forces toward the Balkans. Many historians later argued that this delay contributed to Germany's failure when winter arrived outside Moscow. Ironically, the Tripartite Pact, signed in hopes of avoiding war, ended up provoking exactly the opposite. Attempts at neutrality had collapsed, setting the stage for the devastating invasion that followed. On April 6, 1941, German bombers appeared over Belgrade in the early morning hours. The campaign, codenamed Operation Punishment, began with waves of heavy bombing that continued for 3 days. The air raids were intended not only to disable the Yugoslav army, but also to terrorize the civilian population. Thousands were killed, and fires spread across large parts of the capital. Among the buildings lost was the historic National Library, which housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and rare works. The destruction of so many cultural artifacts symbolized the scale of devastation that happened almost instantly. The bombing was only the beginning. German, Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops invaded from every direction. Yugoslavia's army, large on paper with more than 700,000 men, was poorly coordinated, understaffed in crucial areas, and divided by internal rivalries. Loyalty varied by region, and many soldiers had little will to defend a state they viewed as dominated by rival ethnic groups. Within days, Axis units broke through defenses. German troops advanced rapidly into Serbia. Italians pressed into Montenegro and Dalmatian coastal towns. Hungarians occupied the north, and Bulgarian divisions swept into Macedonia. The country surrendered on April 17th, only 11 days after the first bombs fell on Belgrade. The dismemberment of Yugoslavia followed almost immediately. Germany took northern Slovenia and parts of Serbia, including Belgrade, where it installed an occupation administration. Italy annexed sections of Dalmatia along the coast, added Montenegro to its zone of control, and claimed influence over parts of Kosovo. Hungary absorbed Vojvodina, where Bulgaria annexed most of Macedonia and southern Serbia. Perhaps the most dramatic change came with the creation of the independent state of Croatia, often referred to as the NDH. This state, stretching across Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, was granted to the Ustaci, a fascist movement that had been operating in exile before the invasion. The NDH immediately launched one of the most brutal campaigns in wartime Europe. Its leaders aimed to create an ethnically pure Croat state. Policies targeted Serbs, Jews, and Roma with forced conversions, expulsions, and mass killings. Camps such as Jasenovac became sites of systematic murder. In a few short months, the violence reached levels so extreme that even some German and Italian officials expressed discomfort at its brutality. These policies left scars that would shape relations between communities for generations to come. Serbia itself was placed under direct German military occupation. A puppet administration led by General Milan Nedic operated under German supervision, but real authority remained with the Wehrmacht and Gestapo. Belgrade became a center of repressive rule, where executions and mass arrests were routine. Yet despite this control, resistance began to stir almost immediately. In the mountains of Serbia and Montenegro, groups loyal to the royal government in exile, known as the Chetniks, organized local uprisings. At the same time, communist activists, drawing on networks built before the war, laid the groundwork for what became the partisan movement. The sudden collapse of Yugoslavia stands out in military history. Despite its large army, the kingdom disintegrated in less than 2 weeks. It remains one of the most rapid defeats of a sovereign state in modern times. The reasons went beyond military strength. Deep political divisions, lack of preparation, and mistrust between national groups left the state unable to resist. Unity, already fragile in peacetime, disappeared once the Axis forces crossed its borders. Out of the ruins emerged the stark realities of occupation, terror, and the beginnings of civil war. After the collapse of the Yugoslav kingdom in 1941, the country fractured into occupied zones and puppet states, but almost immediately, resistance began taking shape. Two groups rose above the rest, both claiming to fight for the liberation of the country, yet divided by ideology and strategy. The first were the Chetniks, led by Draža Mihailović, a royalist general who envisioned a Yugoslavia restored under the old monarchy and shaped around the interests of Serbs. The second were the partisans, commanded by Josip Broz Tito, a committed communist who promoted not only liberation from the Axis, but also a social revolution. At first glance, they seemed to share a common goal: driving out foreign occupiers. In practice, their paths diverged almost immediately. The Chetniks concentrated on protecting Serbian civilians, establishing strongholds in rural areas, and waiting for the right moment to strike larger blows. Mihailović believed that premature confrontation with the Axis would only invite brutal reprisals against the population. As a result, Chetnik commanders often avoided combat unless victory seemed likely. Over time, this approach meant they engaged in fewer battles with Axis troops, and in some regions, they even struck local understandings with Italian or German forces to gain supplies or security guarantees against the partisans. These arrangements helped them survive in the short term, but undermined their claim to lead the national resistance. Tito's partisans chose a very different path. They launched a widespread guerrilla campaign, striking German garrisons, sabotaging transportation routes, and mobilizing volunteers across the occupied territories. While rooted in communist ideology, the movement appealed well beyond class politics. Tito emphasized the unity of all South Slavs, regardless of religion or nationality. His slogans invited Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Bosniaks, and others to join side by side in a new struggle that promised not only liberation, but equality. This message attracted growing support, especially in mixed regions like Bosnia, where communities face violence from both occupiers and local collaborators. By 1942, open rivalry between Chetniks and partisans had turned violent. Skirmishes escalated into large battles, with each side trying to assert control over liberated zones. In some regions, Yugoslavia effectively descended into civil war within a broader world war. The complexity intensified in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where partisans, Chetniks, Ustasi militias, and Axis soldiers often fought in the same areas at different times. Civilians found themselves caught between shifting front lines, enduring massacres, reprisal killings, and forced displacements. For villagers, the arrival of armed groups rarely meant protection. Instead, it could trigger violent retaliation from an opposing side only days later. As the war dragged on, the Allies monitored developments inside Yugoslavia closely. At first, Mihailović and the royal government in exile held recognition. But intelligence reports and on-the-ground observations began to highlight the effectiveness of the partisans compared to the often passive Chetniks. By 1943, British and American officials switched their support to Tito. Supplies, weapons, and advisors flowed increasingly into partisan-controlled territory, boosting their capacity to fight. The recognition was a major blow to the Chetniks, who were soon marginalized as collaborators rather than heroes. Across 1943 and 1944, Tito's forces expanded into a disciplined, large-scale military organization. They liberated swaths of territory, created provisional governments, and enforced their vision of unity. By the time the Soviet Red Army entered Yugoslavia in 1944, the partisans were already operating as a conventional army with hundreds of thousands of fighters. They coordinated with the Soviets in the liberation of Belgrade, but continued to emphasize that much of their success had come from within. What made the partisan movement stand out was its achievement compared to resistance groups elsewhere in Europe. Unlike the Free French, whose liberation depended on Allied armies, Tito's forces were uniquely able to drive out occupiers largely by their own strength. This gave them legitimate authority when the war ended and positioned Tito as the uncontested leader of the new Yugoslavia. But such victory carried unimaginable cost. More than 1 million people perished in Yugoslavia during the war, many of them civilians. Killings by occupiers, massacres between rival groups, and retaliatory violence left behind layers of trauma that researchers still debate today. The overlapping roles of victims and perpetrators made these years one of the most morally complex chapters in the entire conflict. When the war ended in 1945, the partisans stood as the dominant force inside Yugoslavia. They had not only resisted the Axis with considerable success, but had also built parallel structures of authority in the territories they liberated. Their leader, Josip Broz Tito, commanded both military power and mass loyalty, and unlike many other partisan leaders in Europe, he entered the post-war period with complete control of the state. By November 29th, the monarchy that had been restored in name during the war was abolished, and the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was declared. The new order defined itself as socialist, born from the anti-fascist struggle and promising an identity that reached beyond narrow nationalism. From the outset, the state was set up as a federation. 6 republics made up its formal structure, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. Within Serbia itself, 2 autonomous provinces were also created, Vojvodina in the north and Kosovo in the south. This arrangement was larger than symbolism. It acknowledged the ethnic and cultural complexity of the region and attempted to give the appearance of balance. Tito's government presented this federal design as a guarantee that no single group would dominate the rest, a lesson drawn from the instability of the interwar kingdom. Despite calling itself a communist state, the new Yugoslavia did not align itself completely with Moscow. At this stage, Tito respected his wartime alliance with the Soviets, but his government also displayed a fierce independence. Unlike the satellite regimes that were being installed elsewhere in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia charted its own course. The guiding slogan became brotherhood and unity. The phrase was not empty propaganda, but a deliberate attempt to reverse the legacies of ethnic violence and civil war. In official events, school programs, and posters, the unity of South Slavs and the equality of different religious groups were promoted as the foundation for the state. However, building that unity required strict political control. The League of Communists from Yugoslavia, as Tito's party came to be called, became the only legal party. Monarchists, rival communists, and those accused of collaboration during the war were arrested or exiled. Purges removed opposition voices, sometimes through trials, other times by simple imprisonment. Political decisions were concentrated in the leadership circles around Tito, and dissent was quickly silenced. The message was clear. Unity could only be protected through one-party control and the firm hand of the partisans now in power. Alongside political consolidation, reconstruction became the regime's top priority. Infrastructure lay in ruins after years of occupation and battles. Roads, bridges, and rail lines were rebuilt with state direction. Factories were nationalized, and industrialization became central to economic policy. Education campaigns aimed at wiping out illiteracy reached rural areas where formal schooling had been scarce. By the late 1940s, visible change marked many cities and towns. Within only a few years, Yugoslavia began to look less like a war-torn land and more like a modern state rebuilding at impressive speed. Yugoslavia also asserted itself on the global stage. Tito refused to allow outside forces to dictate his country's future. He famously threatened to shoot down Allied planes that flew into Yugoslav airspace without permission, a daring stance that few leaders in Eastern Europe could have adopted in the immediate post-war years. In another bold step, Yugoslav units occupied parts of Trieste in Italy just months after the fighting ended. The move nearly sparked direct conflict with Western powers, but also signaled that Yugoslavia was too strong a force to ignore. Tito's government had entered not only the post-war Balkans, but international politics with unprecedented confidence. In the years immediately following the Second World War, Yugoslavia seemed locked firmly into the orbit of the Soviet Union. Josip Broz Tito and his partisan movement had come to power as committed communists, and early cooperation with Moscow was both expected and natural. Like other Eastern European states, Yugoslavia initially aligned its policies with Stalin's leadership and joined the emerging socialist bloc. But beneath the surface, contradictions between the two leaders grew quickly, and by 1948, those contradictions reached a breaking point that stunned the communist world. At the center of the conflict was the question of loyalty. Stalin demanded strict obedience from every leader of the new Eastern Bloc, treating them as regional administrators rather than independent rulers. He expected Yugoslavia to follow Soviet lines in foreign and domestic matters without argument. Tito, however, did not share that vision. He believed the sacrifices and victories of Yugoslavia's partisan struggle had earned his country the right to chart its own course. He was unwilling to surrender that hard-won independence only to be reduced to a subordinate role under Moscow's command. One area of tension was Yugoslav involvement in the Greek Civil War. As communists clashed with royalist forces supported by Britain and the United States, Tito provided them with direct support and sanctuary. Stalin, pursuing a cautious approach to avoid open conflict with the Western powers in Greece, was infuriated. Another dispute arose over the Cominform, the new Communist Information Bureau created in 1947 to coordinate the bloc. Stalin demanded Yugoslavia submit its military and internal policies to its structure. Tito flatly refused, unwilling to give away authority over his army, the very institution that had secured Yugoslavia's freedom. Matters came to a head in June 1948. The Cominform expelled Yugoslavia in a declaration that accused its leaders of betraying socialism. Overnight, a country that had just emerged from the destruction of war found itself cut off from the structures of the international communist community. Throughout Eastern Europe, Allied governments quickly denounced Tito's leadership and echoed Moscow's condemnation. Yugoslavia now faced the possibility of isolation, sanctions, and even military intervention. Stalin attempted to crush Yugoslavia through covert means. Spies infiltrated the Yugoslav state, propaganda attacked Tito in foreign and domestic media, and economic pressure was applied to break ties of trade. Yet the result was the opposite of what Stalin hoped. Tito consolidated power by purging pro-Soviet figures within the League of Communists and turning the security services against dissidents who might side with Moscow. Repression intensified, but so did Yugoslavia's sense of political independence. Out of crisis came the first version of what could be called Titoism, a system that stressed a separate path to socialism outside Soviet control. This independence was dangerous, but it also opened unexpected opportunities. With the split from the Soviet bloc, Yugoslavia searched for economic partners and found them in the West. The United States, anxious to prevent further Soviet expansion in Europe, began delivering financial aid and development programs. For the first time in the Cold War, a communist nation accepted support from Washington without abandoning socialism. The unusual situation meant that Yugoslavia remained the only communist government in Europe capable of receiving aid from both sides of the divided world order. Stalin never forgave Tito for this act of defiance. He tried again and again to eliminate him, sending assassins and encouraging conspiracies. Reports suggest more than 20 different attempts were made, yet none succeeded. Tito himself mocked these failures in a blunt message to Stalin, quote, "Stop sending people to kill me. If you don't stop, I will send one to Moscow, and I won't have to send a second." When Stalin died in 1953, Tito remained in power, stronger than ever and uniquely respected among global leaders. He would ultimately outlive his rival by nearly 30 years, presiding over a Yugoslavia that continued to follow its own independent course. In 1961, at the height of Cold War polarization, Yugoslavia positioned itself in an entirely new role on the international stage. While most communist governments had been absorbed into the Soviet orbit, and much of Western Europe tied itself to NATO, Tito refused to let his country be constrained by either camp. Instead, he set out to organize a third path, one that would allow states to maintain independence while resisting domination from the two superpowers. This idea soon developed into the Non-Aligned Movement, a coalition that would grow into one of the most significant forces in 20th century global diplomacy. The first official non-aligned summit took place in Belgrade in September 1961. Tito hosted the gathering in the Yugoslav capital, welcoming other leaders who shared his search for autonomy in a divided world. Among them were Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Sukarno of Indonesia. These figures represented countries that had only recently emerged from colonial rule and were determined to secure a voice of their own in world politics. By bringing them together under one banner, Yugoslavia signaled that it was not an isolated Balkan state, but a country with a central role in reshaping global alignments. For the nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the Cold War often looked less like a battle of ideologies and more like a continuation of imperial interference. They sought political space where they could pursue their own agendas without being forced into the struggle between Washington and Moscow. The non-aligned movement gave them that platform. It emphasized sovereignty, peaceful coexistence, and resistance to outside domination. Yugoslavia, unexpectedly, became the bridge between these post-colonial regions and the rest of the world, even though it was a European socialist state itself. Non-alignment had clear advantages for Yugoslavia. Economically, it meant access to both East and West. The country could trade with Western societies, drawing in technology and investment while still keeping the socialist system at home and cooperating with fellow communist states when useful. Politically, it gave Tito leverage. He could present himself as a mediator who spoke with leaders on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Hosting the summit in Belgrade began a pattern where Yugoslavia positioned itself as neutral ground, not bound to anyone's agenda, but open to all. This stance had direct effects on daily life for Yugoslav citizens. With their country not locked entirely behind the Iron Curtain, they enjoyed freedoms not available elsewhere in Eastern Europe. A Yugoslav passport granted unusual mobility, allowing travel across both Western and socialist states. This freedom of movement enhanced economic opportunities and created distinctive Yugoslav identity that blended influences from several worlds. For many citizens, that sense of openness made them feel set apart from both their Eastern Bloc neighbors and their Western counterparts. The prestige of Yugoslavia's position is clear when looking at the range of foreign guests Tito entertained. Within only a few years, he received Queen Elizabeth II, U.S. President Richard Nixon, and Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro. The ability to host such varied figures underlined how unusual his political balancing act was. It was rare for any leader, socialist or otherwise, to maintain active relationships across such different political landscapes. By the 1970s, the non-aligned movement had grown into a formidable global force, with Yugoslavia maintaining diplomatic connections to more than 100 nations. Beyond diplomacy, Yugoslav experts contributed to infrastructure projects in Africa, offered military instruction abroad, and even exported films that circulated throughout the developing world. These activities expanded Yugoslavia's soft power. For a country of its size, it had an influence far greater than its population or geography would suggest. The separation from both superpowers, which began as a survival strategy after the split with Stalin, had by now transformed Yugoslavia into a hub of international engagement, shaping the politics of countries far beyond Europe's borders. The decades of the 1960s and 1970s marked a period of unusual prosperity for Yugoslavia. Unlike most of its neighbors in the Eastern Bloc, the country managed to combine socialism with access to Western markets. This strategy created a mixed economy that managed to demonstrate steady growth while also offering its citizens more consumer goods than were available in most other communist states. Factories expanded, Industries modernized, and infrastructure grew to accommodate both domestic needs and international trade. At the same time, the increasing inflow of tourists from Europe and beyond brought valuable foreign currency, while partnerships with Western businesses helped build modern urban skylines that gave cities like Belgrade, Zagreb, Sarajevo, and Ljubljana a new confidence. Industrial development formed the backbone of these years. Heavy industries such as steel manufacturing sat alongside growing automotive and textile sectors, providing jobs while driving large-scale urbanization. At the same time, major infrastructure projects connected the republics more closely, reducing the sense of isolation that had previously marked many regional communities. For many Yugoslavs, this created a sense that the country was catching up with Western societies, even if it still operated under a socialist framework. The rise of a consumer class changed everyday life, as households gained access to televisions, appliances, and cars at rates that stood out compared to other countries in Eastern Europe. An equally important factor was the movement of workers abroad. The Gastarbeiter program allowed hundreds of thousands of Yugoslav citizens to take employment in Western Europe, particularly in Western Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Their wages, far higher than those available at home, were sent back as remittances that supported families and fueled domestic consumption. This labor migration not only strengthened the Yugoslav economy, but also created cultural bridges, as returning workers brought with them new experiences, fashions, and attitudes from abroad. The program became one of the clearest examples of the country's openness compared to its more tightly controlled socialist neighbors. Cultural achievements accompanied this economic expansion. Yugoslavia fostered an atmosphere of artistic and creative pluralism that was rare within socialist Europe. Its cinemas produced films that gained international recognition, often mixing social commentary with experimental techniques. Music ranged from traditional folk forms to growing rock and pop scenes, with bands and performers that gained audiences across the continent. The arts developed in a climate where state sponsorship existed, but with looser controls than those imposed in Warsaw or Moscow. As a result, intellectual life thrived, producing a combination of avant-garde art movements, accessible popular culture, and a unique regional identity that drew interest from abroad. International exposure added to this sense of distinctiveness. In 1961, Yugoslavia became the only communist state to appear in the Eurovision Song Contest, a symbol of its openness toward Western Europe. Participation in such events showcased the country's position as part of the European cultural fabric, while also reinforcing the idea that it was pursuing its own path. For citizens, the knowledge that they belonged to a state represented in both socialist and Western platforms provided pride and reinforced what became known even in those years as Yugo-nostalgia. This nostalgia was built on memories of freedom and travel, stylish consumer products, and a multi-ethnic society that still managed to showcase unity during its best times. One striking detail captured the unique freedom Yugoslavs enjoyed. By the 1970s, their passports permitted travel to more than 100 countries without a visa. These destinations included both the United States and the Soviet Union, a combination that not even many Western Europeans could match. For ordinary Yugoslav citizens, it meant opportunities to study abroad, work overseas, or simply travel for leisure, contributing to a sense of belonging to a wider global community. This unusual advantage underscored how far the country had moved from the isolated conditions of Stalin's Eastern Bloc to an era of connection, consumer growth, and cultural vitality that would later be remembered as its golden age. In 1974, Yugoslavia introduced a constitution that fundamentally changed the way the state operated. Rather than maintaining firm central authority, This new system spread power across its 6 republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, while also elevating its 2 autonomous provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina, to an almost equal status. Each of these regions received broad powers, including their own president, legislature, judiciary, and significant control over economic planning. The design was meant to ensure equality among Yugoslavia's many national groups, but it significantly weakened the ability of the federal government to enforce unity. The inclusion of Kosovo and Vojvodina as near republics was particularly contentious. Both remained legally part of Serbia, but the constitution allowed them the independence to operate almost as if they were fully separate states. Serbian leaders viewed this as a dismantling of their country's historic influence within the federation. Over time, resentment built among Serbian politicians and intellectuals, who argued that their republic was being fragmented internally, unlike any of the others. This sense of unfair treatment would become a major source of grievance in the years that followed, feeding into later nationalist arguments that Serbia had borne the losses of the settlement while other republics gained more freedom. The idea behind the constitutional reform was to lessen ethnic rivalry by creating a balance where no group could dominate. With so many powers placed at the regional level, decisions were expected to arise through negotiation and compromise. But in practice, it created paralysis. Every republic and province had a de facto veto over major federal decisions. Policies on economic planning, education, and internal security often stalled, as Republican leaders prioritized their regional interests over the needs of the whole federation. What Tito saw as a tool for stability often became a mechanism for disagreement, making it difficult to respond rapidly to crises or implement uniform strategies across the entire territory. The Constitution also included an extraordinary guarantee. Tito was confirmed as president for life. This was not merely ceremonial. It ensured that as long as he lived, there would be no question about leadership at the highest level. Tito stood as the one figure capable of commanding loyalty across national lines, and the document enshrined that authority beyond all challenge. Still, beneath that reassurance lay an inevitable question. What would happen to such a fragile arrangement once Tito was no longer around? By embedding his lifetime presidency inside a system built on rotating power, the Constitution practically admitted that his eventual absence posed a profound problem. The structure of leadership pointed to that exact issue. The federal presidency was rewritten to rotate annually among representatives of the republics and provinces. Even while Tito remained alive, this principle began to take practical effect in the secondary institutions of state. Each year, a different leader from a different region held the symbolic top role, while Tito's overall presidency kept the system steady. But the arrangement clearly meant that after his passing, the country would be ruled by a leadership that changed every year, with no permanent center of authority. What was supposed to be a balance risked turning into fragmentation. The scale of the 1974 Constitution reflected its ambitious but perhaps unworkable nature. With 406 articles, it stood as one of the longest and most complicated constitutions written at the time. Even legal experts found it difficult to interpret, since it attempted to formalize so many layers of autonomy and responsibility across different levels of government. The practical outcome was clear enough, though. Leaders began to use the new rules to entrench themselves at the local level. Instead of strengthening unity, the reforms encouraged a return to regionalism. For as long as Tito was alive, he could suppress open conflict. Once he was gone, it was uncertain who, if anyone, would be capable of holding such a divided system together. On May 4, 1980, Josip Broz Tito died at the age of 87 in Ljubljana, Slovenia. His passing marked the end of nearly 4 decades of uninterrupted leadership and the collapse of a central figure who had defined the Yugoslav project. For most people across the Federation, Tito had been more than a politician. He was the symbol of unity, a veteran of the partisan struggle, and the one leader able to stand toe-to-toe with global superpowers while still maintaining independence. His death triggered a wave of national mourning and forced millions to confront an uncertain future where the center no longer held. The mourning process itself was extraordinary. Thousands filed past his coffin in solemn ceremonies, while millions across the republics observed his death as a personal loss. It was not just an internal event. The funeral of Tito became a rare moment of international convergence, drawing leaders from opposing ideological blocs who came together to pay respects. Margaret Thatcher represented Britain, Leonid Brezhnev came from Moscow, Indira Gandhi arrived from India, and Saddam Hussein from Iraq, alongside many others. The attendance, numbering more than 100 international delegations, reflected Yugoslavia's global stature at the time. Few funerals in the 20th century matched it in scale or diversity. Inside the country, however, grief quickly turned to uncertainty. The constitutional arrangements made 6 years earlier now determined the course of governance. The rotating presidency system came into effect, demanding that leadership shift annually between representatives of the 6 republics and 2 provinces. On paper, this ensured fairness. In practice, it produced instability. With no single figure to command authority, decision-making slowed to a crawl. Policies required consensus that often never materialized, and conflicts of interest hardened into open disputes. Without Tito's ability to impose compromise, disputes that had been long suppressed returned to the surface. Serbia grew increasingly resentful of the special autonomy given to Vojvodina and Kosovo. Leaders in Slovenia and Croatia asserted their right to pursue policies more favorable to their own economies rather than federal programs. Questions of ethnic representation and political identity, quieted during Tito's lifetime, became part of the mainstream dialogue again. Leaders across the republics recognized the vacuum, and instead of rallying around the federal state, many focused on building their own regional support. Economic conditions added to this atmosphere. By the early 1980s, Yugoslavia carried a heavy foreign debt, the product of borrowing during the development drives of the previous decade. Inflation worsened, unemployment rose, and living standards stagnated. The state, weakened by the new constitutional framework, did not have the capacity to force through broad reforms to stabilize the economy. Discontent spread unevenly across the republics. Where some regions fared better, others struggled visibly, intensifying the sense that the Federation no longer acted as one coherent unit. Despite these challenges, Tito's legacy remained visible almost everywhere. Streets, factories, and institutions bore his name, and his image appeared in public offices long after his burial. Yet memory could not substitute for authority. No successor emerged with the charisma or legitimacy to unify such a diverse state. Leaders lacked the stature to replace a man who had outlived Stalin, defied Western powers, and mediated global conflicts, and under their weaker leadership, nationalism became the natural alternative for mobilizing support. The funeral itself gave a final indication of just how central Yugoslavia had been during Tito's lifetime. With representatives from 128 countries present, it was larger than the ceremonies that honored Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy, or even Joseph Stalin. Few events brought together so many rivals in one place, and the scale of attendance underscored the influence Tito had wielded. His burial in the House of Flowers in Belgrade carried both symbolic and personal resonance. It was a site of full military honor, despite his lifelong communist identity, and it soon became a pilgrimage site for citizens across the republics. Even today, visitors from the successor states continue to come, a reminder that while the Federation may have disintegrated, the memory of its leader still forms part of a shared past. The 1980s confronted Yugoslavia with a series of problems that exposed the weakness of the Federation after Tito's death. Economically, the country entered the decade carrying an enormous foreign debt. Years of borrowing to fund industrial expansion and infrastructure now returned as obligations it could not afford. Interest payments rose, while declining productivity meant less revenue. Inflation eroded salaries at a rapid pace, and unemployment climbed, especially among the younger generation who faced limited prospects. The optimism of the previous 2 decades began to fade as living standards dropped, and people found it harder to afford goods that had once represented the pride of a mixed socialist economy. The differences between the republics became sharper during this time. Slovenia and Croatia had more developed industries and foreign trade links, which gave them advantages that poorer republics could not match. Bosnia, Macedonia, and Kosovo lagged behind, suffering from chronic unemployment and weak infrastructure. This uneven development fueled increasing resentment. Leaders of the poorer republics accused the wealthier ones of keeping resources for themselves, while Slovenia and Croatia argued that they were carrying the burden of subsidizing others through the federal system. Economic disparity became a political issue, and nationalist narratives framed these inequalities as evidence that true fairness under the Federation could never be achieved. Ethnic tensions layered onto these economic frustrations, particularly in Kosovo. The majority Albanian population there sought greater autonomy and recognition of their rights. Many demanded that Kosovo itself become a full republic on equal footing with the 6 established ones. In 1981, just 1 year after Tito's death, protests by Albanian students and workers exploded into major demonstrations. The government responded with military intervention, declaring the actions a threat to federal unity. Soldiers deployed in the province, curfews were imposed, and hundreds were arrested. The crackdown did little to settle matters. Instead, it marked the beginning of a cycle of protest, repression, and renewed unrest that would characterize Kosovo throughout the decade. The constitutional system left by Tito was supposed to stabilize the Federation, but it achieved the opposite effect. The rotating presidency, with leadership shifting annually between republics and provinces, created a vacuum at the top. As republics disagreed over policies, federal decision-making stalled. Instead of rallying behind common strategies, regional leaders increasingly ignored federal decisions and pursued their own course. Institutions that had once presented a united front against outside threats now proved incapable of resolving disputes at home. This atmosphere produced fertile ground for a reimagining of nationalism. Slovenian and Croatian intellectuals developed programs stressing autonomy, arguing that their republics deserved more control over their economies and political systems. In Serbia, a different argument rose to prominence. Writers, academics, and later political leaders complained that the autonomy given to Kosovo and Vojvodina fragmented Serbian power. Their solution was a call for re-centralization under Serbian leadership, a position that would eventually escalate into demands for dominance within the Federation. What had once been dismissed as fringe debates began entering everyday politics, openly discussed in newspapers, universities, and street gatherings. Culture reflected these divisions as well. By the late 1980s, Yugoslav musicians and filmmakers pushed boundaries in ways few other communist states tolerated. Rock bands performed songs mocking government inefficiency, while satirical films addressed ethnic rivalries and political dysfunction. These cultural productions gave ordinary people space to confront taboos, even as official politics claimed unity. In many ways, pop culture became an unofficial channel for expressing frustrations and fears about the Federation's future. Externally, Yugoslavia's economic crisis tied it even more tightly to Western creditors. Debt reached more than $20 billion at its height. To qualify for emergency loans from institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the government introduced austerity measures. Prices rose, subsidies disappeared, and everyday goods became scarce. The pressure devastated ordinary families who faced unemployment at home or the need to migrate abroad for work. Strikes and protests multiplied, while a growing underground economy replaced the official system, reflecting how far the Federation had strayed from the prosperity of previous decades. By the start of the 1990s, Yugoslavia was unraveling. The federal government existed in name, but lacked the power to enforce decisions. Regional leaders, now elected through democratic contests, quickly replaced the old communist elite. The introduction of multi-party elections in 1990 was a dramatic change after more than 4 decades of one-party control. Instead of producing moderate leaders committed to compromise, it swept nationalist parties into power. In nearly every republic, campaigns centered on identity and historical grievances, and the victors appealed to ethnic loyalty rather than the old idea of brotherhood and unity. In Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic emerged as the dominant political figure. He promoted the vision of a renewed federation, but one under centralized Serbian control. His stance placed him at odds with Slovenia and Croatia, which demanded greater independence. Slovenia, with its relatively small and ethnically uniform population, was already the most economically advanced republic. Its leaders saw little benefit in remaining tied to the problems of the wider federation. Croatia followed a similar path, but its situation was more complex. A large Serb minority inside Croatia had little interest in breaking away from the Yugoslav state, and this internal division would soon turn violent. On June 25, 1991, both Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. The Yugoslav People's Army, which had long described itself as a multi-ethnic socialist army, was by then mostly controlled by Serbian officers. It moved quickly to suppress the declarations. In Slovenia, this produced the 10-Day War, a short conflict marked by minor clashes between Slovenian defense forces and the federal army. The conflict ended in a negotiated ceasefire, as Slovenia was not viewed as strategically vital and its ethnic homogeneity made sustained conflict less practical. Croatia, however, descended into a far bloodier struggle. In Croatia, Serb militias, armed with support from the federal army, staged uprisings and declared their own separatist entities. They proclaimed the formation of regions that rejected Croatian authority, insisted they remained part of what was left of Yugoslavia. The fighting soon spread across towns and cities, with sieges and battles that caused massive destruction. The city of Vukovar became one of the most visible symbols of the conflict after weeks of bombardment left it in ruins. Ethnic cleansing campaigns drove Croats from Serb-controlled zones and Serbs from Croat-controlled territory, setting a pattern of violence and displacement that would extend into Bosnia and beyond. Bosnia and Herzegovina, the most diverse republic, was caught in the middle of these developments. With large communities of Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks, its politicians struggled to maintain balance as Yugoslavia crumbled. Each community feared domination by the others, and all sides prepared for the possibility of war. Political compromises grew increasingly fragile, while paramilitary groups began to organize independently. Bosnia's strategic importance and ethnic complexity made it the likely next battleground once Slovenia and Croatia had broken away. International actors attempted mediation. The European Community and later the United Nations sought to negotiate peace plans while debating recognition of the breakaway republics. Germany pushed ahead with recognition of Croatia and Slovenia by the end of 1991, a move that sparked controversy inside Europe. Some argued it encouraged further disintegration and accelerated violence, while others insisted it acknowledged realities already on the ground. Amid this chaos, Yugoslavia still technically upheld the rotating presidency system established in 1974. In 1991, the chair was due to pass to Croatia. Serbia rejected the transfer, effectively blocking the arrangement and revealing the federal system as a hollow shell. The refusal symbolized that even the pretense of a united state had collapsed. By early 1992, independence declarations, armed insurgencies, and international involvement confirmed that Yugoslavia was no longer a single country, but a battlefield of competing national projects. On March 1, 1992, Bosnia and Herzegovina declared independence after holding a referendum that was boycotted by most of its Serb population. Supported by Slobodan Milosevic in Belgrade and backed by units of the Yugoslav People's Army, Bosnian Serb leaders rejected the vote and initiated a campaign to carve out a new state inside Bosnia. Their objective was to join these territories with Serbia in hopes of building what was often described as a Greater Serbia. This move ignited the bloodiest conflict in the collapse of Yugoslavia and set the stage for one of the most complex wars in post-war European history. The conflict quickly organized itself into a three-sided struggle. Bosniaks, predominantly Muslim, supported the independence of Bosnia. Croats aligned themselves with Croatia's national aspirations, sometimes cooperating with Bosniaks, but at other moments pursuing their own territorial ambitions. Bosnian Serbs controlled significant areas of the countryside and had the support of heavy weapons inherited from the Yugoslav army. Each community formed its own armed forces, militias, and local defense units. Alliances shifted during the war, with periods of cooperation giving way to hostility as rival groups sought advantage in a landscape defined by rapidly changing front lines. The Bosnian Serb army emerged as the strongest single faction. Led by Radovan Karadzic as political leader and General Ratko Mladic as military commander, its strategy centered on ethnic cleansing. Villages, towns, and entire regions became targets. Non-Serb civilians were expelled, detained in makeshift camps, or massacred outright. The goal was to establish territory free of other populations, creating continuous Serb-controlled regions connected to Serbia proper. Communities that had lived side by side for centuries suddenly became enemies, and many were destroyed through systematic campaigns of terror. Urban centers suffered immense destruction. Sarajevo, the capital, was placed under siege for nearly 4 years from 1992 to 1996. Sniper fire and shelling terrorized the civilian population daily. Over 11,000 people died during the siege, including thousands of children, as the city endured the longest blockade of capital in modern warfare. Supplies of food, water, and medicine were scarce, and yet its residents organized ways to survive, building underground tunnels, holding makeshift schools, and even staging concerts to maintain a sense of life. The cultural heart of the city, including historic libraries and monuments, was also targeted, representing an assault not only on people, but on the legacy of Bosnia's multi-ethnic identity. Other cities witnessed similar horror. Mostar, known for its Ottoman-era bridge, became a site of prolonged combat between Bosniak and Croat forces, and its heritage was reduced to rubble. Across the countryside, reports surfaced of detention camps where civilians were beaten, starved, and subjected to systematic abuse, including rape used deliberately as a weapon of war. The scale of sexual violence was unprecedented in Europe since the Second World War, and years later, tribunals would reveal that more than 60% of all rape cases brought before international courts of that era traced back to Bosnia. The war's most infamous atrocity came in July 1995 in Srebrenica. Declared a safe area by the United Nations, the enclave fell to Bosnian Serb forces. Over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were separated from their families and murdered in a matter of days. The incident was later legally defined as genocide by international courts, the worst crime of its kind in Europe since 1945. International intervention lagged. United Nations peacekeepers deployed but had little mandate and were often powerless to prevent atrocities. Only in 1995, after the shelling of Sarajevo's Markale market killed scores of civilians, did NATO launch sustained airstrikes against Bosnian Serb positions. These actions shifted the balance on the ground and forced all sides toward negotiations. The war formally ended in December 1995 with the Dayton Accords, signed in the United States. Bosnia and Herzegovina remained a single sovereign state, but was divided into two entities: the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, dominated by Bosniaks and Croats, and Republika Srpska, largely Serb-controlled. The arrangement froze the conflict and preserved Bosnia's territorial integrity, but it embedded deep political divisions that continue to shape the country to this day. After the Bosnian War ended, attention in the Balkans shifted south to Kosovo, a province of Serbia with an ethnic Albanian majority. For decades, the Albanian population had demanded greater rights, either in the form of enhanced autonomy or outright independence. Their grievances stretched back generations, but they sharpened sharply in 1989 when Slobodan Milosevic revoked Kosovo's autonomy. Overnight, the province lost the authority it had been granted under the old Yugoslav constitution. Albanian language schools were closed, political organizations were banned, and direct police and military control from Belgrade became the new normal. What followed was a decade of repression that bred deep resentment. Instead of silencing calls for self-determination, it created an atmosphere of hostility and mistrust that soon spiraled toward armed conflict. By the middle of the 1990s, patience among many Kosovar Albanians gave way to militancy. This was the moment when the Kosovo Liberation Army began to take shape. The KLA organized armed groups that targeted Serbian police, government officials, and military units inside Kosovo. At first, these attacks were limited, and Belgrade dismissed the KLA as little more than a terrorist network. But as the organization expanded and gained support from Albanians abroad, its actions grew bolder. Its stated goal was simple: force Belgrade's withdrawal and secure independence. The Serbian state responded with overwhelming force, determined to eliminate the KLA and reassert control over the province in a show of strength. Beginning in 1998, the campaign escalated into a counterinsurgency effort conducted by the Yugoslav army and Serbian police units. Villages suspected of harboring KLA fighters were burned, while thousands of residents were rounded up in mass arrests. Reports of executions and systematic violence became widespread. Families were forced from their homes, and entire communities emptied as the campaign tore across rural Kosovo. Instead of crushing armed resistance, the assault intensified local support for the KLA and drew mounting international condemnation. As winter turned towards spring in 1999, the violence created a humanitarian crisis. Hundreds of thousands of ethnic Albanians fled across the borders into Macedonia and Albania, while others were expelled directly as part of coordinated campaigns of forced displacement. Images of columns of refugees and burned villages circulated worldwide, raising pressure on the international community to act. Several rounds of negotiations failed, with neither side willing to concede its core demands. Belgrade insisted Kosovo must remain a part of Serbia, while Kosovo Albanians rejected anything short of full independence. With diplomacy stalled, NATO intervened. On March 24, 1999, a coalition of NATO states began a bombing campaign against Yugoslav military targets, command facilities, and critical infrastructure. The campaign lasted 78 days, marking the first time NATO attacked a sovereign country without a mandate from the United Nations. The air war was fought without the use of ground troops from NATO forces, making it historically significant as the first war waged entirely by air power. The destruction across Serbia was extensive, and civilian infrastructure, including bridges, factories, and the power grid, suffered heavy damage. By June, the pressure proved overwhelming. Milosevic agreed to withdraw his forces from Kosovo. NATO peacekeepers entered the province under a mission formally administered by the United Nations. Legally, Kosovo remained part of Serbia. In practice, it was now governed by international authorities, setting the foundation for its later unilateral declaration of independence. The war left scars that stretched far beyond politics. More than 850,000 ethnic Albanians had been displaced, and forensic evidence discovered later revealed mass graves scattered across Serbia. Some moved in attempts to hide atrocities. These findings demonstrated the systematic nature of the crimes and defined the Kosovo conflict as both a turning point in NATO's role in global politics and a tragic final act in the violent collapse of Yugoslavia. By the early years of the new millennium, very little remained of the Yugoslavia that had once stood as a multi-ethnic federation. What was left was a reduced state made up only of Serbia and Montenegro. Officially, it carried the name Federal Republic of Yugoslavia after 1992. But in 2003, it was rebranded as the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro. This change of terminology reflected what the country had become, a looser political arrangement, not a unified state in the traditional sense. Each republic operated with its own government, budget, and economic system, functioning almost like two separate states tied together by shared diplomacy and military structures. For most people living in Belgrade or Podgorica, life was marked by the differences between the two entities rather than any strong sense of belonging to the same federation. The symbolic nature of the union became clear in 2006, when Montenegro decided to hold its own referendum on independence. European Union observers insisted on a strict requirement. A majority of at least 55% would be needed to validate the vote. The results revealed how divided the population was. Just over that threshold, at 55.5%, decided in favor of breaking away. On June 3, 2006, Montenegro officially declared independence, and the union dissolved without major violence or conflict. A political partnership that had once been the last remnant of the Yugoslav state disappeared almost overnight, replaced with two fully separate republics. 2 days later, on June 5th, Serbia followed with its own declaration. It announced itself as the sole legal successor of the former state, inheriting the diplomatic representation, the army, and the continuity of international obligations. The moment carried symbolic weight far greater than the administrative procedure of transferring offices or flags. For the first time in nearly a century, Yugoslavia ceased to exist as a political entity in any form. A state that once stretched from the Adriatic coast to the borders of Greece and Hungary now ended with Serbia standing alone as its heir. The question of Kosovo soon complicated the picture further. Although it remained officially part of Serbia, the province had been under United Nations administration since the end of the 1999 war. Calls for full independence accelerated, and in 2008, the declaration finally came. Kosovo unilaterally announced itself as a sovereign state. More than 100 countries eventually recognized its independence, but powerful actors such as Russia and China refused, as did Serbia. This decision left Kosovo's status unresolved, its recognition fragmented across the international system. For the region, it became the last major step in the disintegration of Yugoslavia, confirming that the old federal territory had split into 7 distinct political units. By this time, the map of the Balkans was completely redrawn. Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Kosovo, still disputed by some states, replaced the single country that had once projected unity. Each of these new republics began moving at its own pace toward European integration. Yet the conflicts of the 1990s, the displacement of populations, and the persistence of nationalism left scars that shaped public opinion and political life well into the 21st century. The process of joining European institutions became not just a path toward prosperity, but also a way to manage the divisions left behind. The years of collapse also left behind unusual reminders. Hyperinflation during the 1990s had been so severe that one of the last denominations of the Yugoslav dinar printed carried a value of 500 billion. Banknotes of this scale became collector's items, a grim monument to the economic collapse that had preceded the final disintegration. And the wider historical scale highlighted how fast the transformation had taken place. A country once praised for its balance between East and West, often seen as proof that socialist multiculturalism could endure, had by 2008 gone through 4 wars, multiple cases of ethnic cleansing, the rise and fall of communism, and the emergence of 7 new states. Few regions of Europe had witnessed such concentrated upheaval in the span of a single generation. Yugoslavia was never a nation in the traditional sense. It was an experiment, stitched together from empires and held by fragile compromise. Without Tito, power struggles and nationalism tore it apart. Its history leaves us with a question: can unity survive without shared identity, or is division inevitable? If you found this story thought-provoking, subscribe for more deep dives into the rise and fall of nations.